Here is what I want to do. I want to tell you a few stories. Does that make sense? I'll just tell a few stories. But I'll also tell some key takeaways from my personal journey. And these are in no way, reflection of anything grandiose. It's just some stories and some of my personal takeaways. Is that okay? And I'll tell you 3, 4 stories, right? And try to put everything in context. I think Alfred briefly spoke about my career at SAP. Um, I was 33 when I was made the managing director of SAP Labs in India. I had 4,000 engineers working with me. I was at my high. I had married my college sweetheart, so we went to college together, me and my wife. Um, she was a Hindu, I was a Muslim, so it was a perfect recipe for disaster. But we got married after 10 years, and I thought, this is incredible. How often can you fall in love and get married? Especially if you're a Hindu and a Muslim, right? So we got married, and then we had our first kid, and our only kid, Vivaan, incredibly good looking. Um, you know, the ad agency guys used to come and ask that they wanted to photograph him and put in ads, and my wife was like, no, this is my kid, and I'm not going to, this is not for everybody else, this is mine. We had a great time. And one day, I was having dinner with my boss, who had come over from the US and said we were having family dinner. He called me at the side and he said, Feroz, can I tell you something? And I'm like, yeah. He said, I think you should get your son checked up. And I'm like, for what? He said, no, I think that he could have an issue. And I'm like, what? He said, I think he could be autistic. And I'm like, what do you mean? What is autistic? I don't know. And why are you saying that? He said, your son is not making eye contact. And I'm like, but that's okay. I mean, he's just 18 months, no big deal. I'm sure he would do that. I went home, did a Google search on what is autism. And I looked at the characteristics of autistic children. What are the top 10 characteristics? The first, doesn't make eye contact. So in my case, it was checked. The second, non-social. And I'm like, yeah, he's not very social. Check. Third, they sometimes walk on the toes. And I'm like, yeah, he does. Check. Fourth, he does the same thing over and over again. I'm like, yeah, he does watch the same songs in his iPad all the time. Check. And I went through that list and I was like, holy cow, this seems to be a real problem. I went and told my wife, and my wife was not very amused, right? She's like, son is perfect, don't worry. How can somebody say he has a problem? I'm like, no, let's get and check it out. And that started a regular doctor visit. And after 3 months, me and my son were outside the doctor. Doctor called us in, and he gave the diagnosis. He said, your son is autistic. And we both drove back home for 30 minutes. I went home, locked myself in the bathroom, and cried for 30 minutes straight. And I'm like, my perfect world has come to an end. The doctor said, and I was like, so what's the medication? How do we fix this, right? Like, there is no medication. This is a condition for life. And I'm like, what do you mean condition for life? There has to be a way out. I went through severe depression, like every parent in the world goes through when you are hit with something as challenging situation as this. We went through emotions of denial. And at some point, we got to a stage where we said, maybe this is what it is. We got out of it. And then I got a phone call that changed my life. So one of my mentors was Dr. Kiran Bedi. She's one of the most famous Indian leaders, won a Magsaysay Award, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize many times. I was very fortunate to know her, work with her very closely. So I hadn't spoken to her for over a month. And so she called me and said, Feroz, why is this radio silence? You haven't spoken to me. What happened? Is everything okay? And I said, ma'am, Vivaan is just diagnosed with autism. I don't know what to do. And she told me something which was incredibly profound. She said, Feroze, most people in the world spend their entire life not knowing what their purpose is. You're incredibly fortunate that the purpose has found you. And I'm like, what does that mean? She said, you are in a position of authority. You have the financial means. You have the intellect to make not just a difference for your son, but thousands and thousands of others who are like him. Make that your purpose. It was like in my mind there was a switch that kind of turned on. That moment, like I wasn't seeing it this way. But I had no clue what to do. Now here was the problem. I was in India where autism was not even considered a disability, because the disability bill was written in 1986 and was not updated. So autism was not considered a disability, which means there were no funds from the government. In India, any kind of disability was considered a taboo. So people didn't speak about it if you had a problem. So there was no schools and special education for children in the spectrum. There were a few which were privately run, but nothing by the government. I had no clue what to do. I started talking to a few of my friends in SAP, and we said, okay, what is it that we can do? I had no clue. I realized one thing, that I was a technologist, so the only thing I can do is use my understanding of technology to make a difference and not try to fix it, because I'm not a doctor, so I don't know what to do. But let's see if technology can do something. It led to a series of one thing led to the other. One person actually connected me to an incredible entrepreneur in Denmark. But before that, I was actually speaking to a lot of parents. I said, I wanted to understand what does parents go through. In a series of conversations, I realized there was one common factor that all of them told me. And I said, what's your biggest fear? And they said that my biggest fear is I don't know what to do with my child after I'm gone. This was the only statement that I heard from every parent with a special needs child. And there was one moment when one of the fathers told me something that literally broke my heart. And he said, Feroze, my wish is to live one day more than my child, because I don't want to leave him alone. And that for me was a moment where I said, I can't leave this problem to somebody else to solve it. What is the problem? And then I was told that the problem is the people on the autism spectrum, while they were incredibly gifted, the world didn't see it that way. It was not that they were not competent or not capable, but the world didn't see their abilities. They mostly focused on their disabilities. So what was their abilities and what was their disabilities? The problem that I was told is that people on the autism spectrum can never be independent because they can never get a job. And they can never get a job because all jobs in the world, practically all jobs in the world, requires two things: good communication skills and the ability to work in teams. You can look at any interview process in the world, they will have these two as your first conditions. Can you work in a team? And do you have good communication skills? Unless, of course, if you're a musician. And people on the autism spectrum can't do these things too well. And my friend in Denmark, Thorkel Sonne, had actually turned around the same problem, and he said, let's not focus on what these children can't do, let's focus on what they can do. And the thing that they can do is they have a good memory, because they see the world in pictures, so they have good memory. They can do the same things over and over again. So why don't we use those skills and try to fit into specific jobs that can be done by them? He was a technologist, so he said, let me see if there's a fit for these kind of jobs in the technology world. And he suddenly found that testing is one area which requires you to do the same thing over and over again without getting bored, and also doing it without making mistakes and having a good memory. It kind of fitted in. So he started hiring people on the autism spectrum for a for-profit initiative. This was not charity. He said, I want them to produce results which are as good as anybody else. I heard about this, flew down to Denmark, spent 2 days in his office, figured out what he was doing. I came back and I realized I had 600 testers at SAP in India. 600. Out of my 4,000 people, 600 were doing testing. And I was like, you know what? maybe I should just hire a few people on the autism spectrum. I hired 4 of them, but the problem was in India, nobody went to school because there was no special needs school for autistic children. So they were not people who had gone and had a degree. Many of them knew English, they were good at browsing the internet, but we said, let's try it out. So we hired 4 of them, and we got them into the work function. We had to make a lot of adjustments. But the interesting thing was, after 2 years, we proved that the people on the autism spectrum were actually better than my engineers. We proved it by data, that their outcome was better. They never made mistakes. They had 100% success rate. And more importantly, they never lied. They never asked for promotions. They also wanted to work on weekends. They never understood, why do you not work on Saturday and Sunday? I want to work now. And we said, no, you can't work on Saturday and Sundays. So that was an incredible combination. How rare is it to find employees who tell you the truth, never ask for a promotion, never ask for a salary hike, want to work on weekends, and even do better than other engineers? And I'm like, what a contradiction. Why the hell don't we hire them more across the world? So what happened after this was a series of accidents. I call them serendipity, I call them accidents. Forbes journalist got to hear about this. He came and did an interview. And he said, wow, this is incredible. He wrote a story which went completely viral. The journalist actually won some awards for the story he wrote. It was called Everybody is Good at Something. I was selected at the World Economic Forum in Davos, so I was invited to go there and speak about an idea that can change the world. So you get 5 minutes to do that, just 5 minutes, but you have the world as an audience. Luck has it that CNN was there to listen to my speech. They carried my speech verbatim the next day. Exactly 5 minutes, whatever I spoke. It's actually 4.5 minutes. It's still there on YouTube, you can check it out. CNN carried the news, and guess what happened? The SAP CEOs were sitting there. And they read the news and they called me to the breakfast meeting and said, is this true? I'm like, yeah, I've been doing this for 2 years. I didn't tell anybody, I just did it. They said, okay, if this makes sense, this makes business sense, let's do it at SAP level. I'm like, okay. And then he asked, what percentage of the people are on the autism spectrum? I said, 1%. Guess what happened? I gave the speech in January. In June, SAP, in its largest technology event ever, it's called the Sapphire Conference, happens in Orlando, 25,000 people attended every year. We made an announcement that we will make hire 1% of the global workforce with people on the autism spectrum. So we were 65,000 people. We said 650 people will hire on the autism spectrum. I wrote the press release, and the press guy said, Ferose, don't worry, nobody's going to read this anyway. Because this is a tech conference. Why would anybody be interested in an autism story? We did the press release on Thursday. On Saturday night, the head of diversity and inclusion called me and said, Ferose, our phone has not stopped ringing. We had the maximum media coverage ever in our 45-year-old history. We got more media coverage for autism at work than for any product launch in our 45-year-old history. I had CNN and BBC outside my office, like, where are these kids? Show me them, right? I'm like, what are this? Like, this is normal stuff. Didn't look too different for me. Last year, in April, it became an official Harvard case study. And last year, I was invited to the United Nations by Ban Ki-moon, asking other corporates to make similar commitments. So from what started as a weekend project with a few volunteers, not knowing what we were up to, in less than 4 years, it's become a global movement. And I say my mission is to create 1 million jobs, not just with people on the autism spectrum, but all people whom I think is not given a chance by the society. I think everybody is good at something. We just need to give them a chance. Now, let me share two small stories, and then I will tell you the key takeaways. I haven't told you the key, I've just told you the story. Let me tell you the second very interesting story. And everything that I'm talking about, while I'm using autism as an anecdote, it's, I think, applicable across. So I'm talking about inclusion broadly. One of my friends is Steve Silberman. He wrote a book called Neurotribes, which is considered the Bible for autism. And he's really the one who's getting neurodiversity back into the center stage. He wanted to research about autism. He spent 10 years researching about autism. And he said, I wanted to understand what's happening really deeply. So there used to be a conference called, which is run by autistic people for autistic people. So only if you're autistic can you attend the conference. I think it's called Autreat. So everybody who comes to the conference is autistic. It is hosted by autistics. It is run by autistics. Its participants are autistic. So he said, I want to go and see what happens there. So he got a permission somehow to get in, and he said, I'm not going to do anything. I just want to sit in the corner and observe. He got in, and he was surprised to see what was happening. He found the same people who were considered non-social, didn't have a sense of humor, didn't communicate. They were exactly opposite. These children, or these autistic people in the room, were having fun. They were cracking jokes. They were being sarcastic. They were completely social. And for that moment, he said, Ferose, I felt as if I'm the autistic person in the room. Now, what you have to understand is that it's all about the context. Context matters. If you flip the majority to a minority, behavior change happens. Imagine if you have to spend your entire lifetime as a minority, it will kill your confidence. But if you flip that, it's a completely different world. So in most contexts in our lives, it's always about context, and if you have to change the behavior, you have to flip the context. Why am I saying this? In 2012, when I realized the problem was awareness in India, was acceptance, was awareness, was a complete lack of awareness, I started something called the India Inclusion Summit, which in the last 6 years has now become the world's largest inclusion platform for people with all kinds of disabilities. We had one simple design principle. The design principle was make the minority the majority and the majority the minority. So every year, 1,000 people attend the event. We make sure that more than 500 people are directly disabled or have a direct connection with disability. And you wouldn't believe when you walk into the room, magic happens. The people who are able suddenly start feeling disabled, and the people who are disabled start feeling like rock stars. Because you have changed the context. And let me give you what I mean by that. And the entire event is fully democratic. I'll explain some of the organizing principles of that. I had a person with profound disability sitting in the front row, profound disability. She needs support to walk. A mom always takes her wherever she has to go. The event is happening. We have a celebrity on stage, a very famous celebrity. And he's talking, and suddenly I find that the girl who has profound disability, cannot walk on her own, suddenly starts getting up off her stage and walks and hugs the film star. And the mother says, this has never happened before. What happened was, at that moment, she felt safe. She felt she was a majority. She felt she was in the company of people who wouldn't judge her, and she was herself. Behavior change happens when you shift the context. That's been a core design principle. Let me tell you another interesting story. In the 1970s, they found that only 5% of the people in the best orchestra were women. Only 5%. In the US. Even though women were considered equally talented and great musicians, but only 5% were women. In the next 2 decades, that 5% became 35%. You know what happened? They just introduced one simple design change. They didn't train more women. They didn't spend on training budgets. They didn't make any quota systems, nothing. They just did one design change. And the design change was they introduced blind auditions. As soon as blind auditions happened, you were inducted into the orchestra based on the music that you hear, not on seeing the other person. So the realization was human beings were fundamentally biased. It's very difficult to change bias. You can throw tons and tons of money on training programs. You cannot change bias. What you need to do is make subtle design changes. And our inclusion event, everything is about making subtle design changes in a way that people don't understand that, but it's very subtle design changes. Let me tell you the last story. You know, when we started the summit in 2012, our mission was to make India inclusive. I realized that, you know, if you really want to move the needle, start with awareness. People can find their own problems. They can fix it themselves. You don't have to do it for them. Just spread awareness. Make people aware and sensitive. They will find the problems themselves. We had a small problem. India is a slightly bigger country than Norway. You know, it's a little, just a few. We have 1.3 billion people, right? So spreading inclusion to 1.3 billion is a little bit of a task, right? And I was like, how do we do this? What's the organizing principle? What's the organization structure? So we did everything exactly opposite of what every other nonprofit or event does. Let me share a few design principles there. It is a nonprofit organization called the India Inclusion Foundation. We have no paid employees. So there are no full-time employees there. The second design principle is we call this no logos and no egos. We do this event, we said it has to be the TED for inclusion, that high quality, but we make it completely free for all its participants. So people say like, so how the hell does this work? I mean, somebody has to pay it, right? I mean, yeah, corporations paid. You know, once one of the CEOs of a large multinational came and said, Feroze, I want to be the platinum sponsor. I'm like, you can be, but you know, that's okay. You can pay as much as you want, but there is no logo anywhere. And we don't tell who is a platinum sponsor. You just have to show up and do the right stuff. So no logos and no egos. Everything is free, everything is democratic. So people ask me, how does this work? So it works in a principle called team of teams. We empower people downwards, not upwards. The founders and the teams are mostly invisible. We say that's the day for the champions of inclusion. We want to create a platform for the champions of inclusion. So that's where they are seen. None of us are seen. That's the organizing principle. Because we believe that organizational structures are limited in its impact. If you have to reach to 1.3 billion people, the org structure will not work. You have to do it completely differently. You have to give the ownership to everybody else. So we say it's a community-driven event. People do it. We don't know how it happens, but we have a team of teams that make it work. So since I sent something to Alfred, I will show it to you anyway. So this is my last 5 minutes. So what I'm calling here is designing for inclusion, driving change both in large corporates as well as societies. That's my son, Vivaan. Now he's grown up a little bit. He's 8 years old now, completely non-verbal, but he's incredible. And a lot of time, me and my wife are thinking, how do we become the minority in the house? Because he's the only guy who can't speak, and we both are able to speak. So we're trying to get to a stage where we stop speaking ourselves, so that he feels included. Otherwise, he will always grow up thinking he's a minority, so we want to change the context. This is how it all started. It all started with February 11th as a weekend project, and today we are committed to hiring 650 people by 2020, and 127 people are already hired. Now here is what almost everybody asks me, Feroze, how is it that the autism project started in India, where autism was not even recognized, On the contrary, US every year spends billions and billions of dollars on autism research, but nobody thought about this as a possibility. And I said, that's exactly the reason why it happened. Because there is enough evidence to show that core, the real changes never happen from the core. They always happen from the edges. Real transformation, whether it's in organizations or in societies, will always happen at the edges. The edges will become big, and the core will move to the edge. That's how transformations have happened in organizations. That's how transformations will happen in societies. I was hearing about the Gross National Happiness Index. It's a great example of something happening at the edge. And I am pretty confident that edge will become so important at some point that the GDP will shift to the national happiness. It will never happen from the core itself. All changes in societies are driven from the edge, and they become big enough so that the core moves to the edge. It will take time, but it will happen. I always say that passion is not good enough. You need to work with passion and with compassion. And with passion and compassion, you can change the world. That's the article that the Forbes journalist wrote about how autistics could triumph at SAP Labs. The girl's photograph, whom you can't see, is the first girl whom we hired on the autism spectrum. Her face is not facing, of course, so we wanted to keep that privacy there. But she was sitting at home and playing video games. Most of the autistic people, 85 to 90% of them are unemployed, even though they can contribute in a meaningful manner. This is the Harvard case study about autism at work. This is what I said. The edge will transform the core. Large-scale transformations happen this way. Another very interesting that happened was that when Harvard did a study which showed that women, they gave a better speech when they saw the picture of Hillary Clinton before they went on stage, rather than if they saw a picture of Bill Clinton. Visual cues matter. So what Harvard did, and what United Nations did after that, was that they started putting the pictures of women role models on their institutions. So if you go to UN, you will see there are more women role models like Malala's and others whose pictures are kept there. They remove some of the pictures of the male role models, and they say visual cues matter. We do the same with our website. This is the India Inclusion website. Do you see something interesting there? There's somebody with disability there. And we show it. We never talk who is disabled or not, but we show them because visual cues matter. You suddenly start feeling that you can be a disabled person and you can be a role model. Blind auditions, as I said, increased from 5 to 35%. These are small, and it's found that these small design changes has much more profound impact than any training programs that you would invest in, because human beings are fundamentally biased. For large-scale changes, you need to have committed teams of teams. Thank you so much. Have a good day.